Hello, everyone. I hope that you are all having a wonderful Friday. I wanted to check in for a minute and talk about the Myths Reflection assignment. So, I've just finished grading these, and for the most part, you guys did a really wonderful job. Um, I've mentioned this several times, but I'm a definite face to face professor. So, I always like to drop in after grading an assignment like this and kind of do my own reflection and let me know what I learned from you guys. So, one thing that I found common across several different reflections was this notion of working with gifted children and how we actually all have the capability to work with gifted kids. So, a lot of times we get this gifted endorsement hoping that we could teach a gifted class or we could teach the challenge course in elementary school or the honors classes or the AP classes. But hopefully, what you're starting to see is that gifted kids are everywhere, especially those that have not been identified yet. So, for you that are in quote regular ed classrooms, this class is just as important as if you're working with fully gifted students and not in a regular education setting. That's actually something that I'm really passionate about because typically in teacher ed programs, you don't get a lot of training in gifted education. And the regular education teachers are the ones that often identify kids in the first place. So, this assignment is showing us that we all have different types of assumptions or different beliefs that are not true about gifted kids. And unless we really confront those assumptions, we just continually identify the stereotypical, well behaved, perfect child as gifted. So I'm glad to see you guys really critically reflecting on some of these things. The majority of you were very surprised by ability grouping. And I wrote back to several of you and mentioned that I was surprised by that as well at first. I do want to take us back to that documentary when we kind of got to get into the children's heads, and even that video about the brain where we saw how the gifted brain works and how it's actually very different than a student's brain who has not been identified as gifted. So what I want to talk about in that sense is in terms of ability grouping, we're grouping these students who are identified as gifted together because their brains work the same way, right? So they're able to see the world in a similar manner. They're able to, quote, get each other. And when we can get each other, then we can challenge each other. A lot of times with heterogeneous grouping, the gifted child becomes the tutor, becomes the person who is reviewing the material. And yes, teaching material is the best way to learn it. I'm sure we all know that. But also imagine the material being so obvious, like it's a 2+2 situation, and your teacher tells you continually, hey, go over there and work in that group. They're struggling with this 2+2 problem, and you get to review the material at the same time. That's not going to really keep the gifted child, very entertained for long. So we're really doing them a disservice. One of you, Rebecca, actually pointed out we wouldn't know there's an ELL student in the class and then not provide ELL services. So why should there be gifted students in the class and we're not providing the appropriate gifted services? I thought that was a really good point that she made. Again, I'm looking at my notes here, I wanted to touch on the fact that regular ed teachers are those gatekeepers for gifted education. And I wanted to give a shout out to Maddie for being the kindergarten teacher who's also taking this class. And again, identification, so important. Usually we think of identification in terms of the test score. As we get more and more into this class, as you're probably already seeing with the characteristics module, there are multiple ways to identify gifted students. So teacher observations, looking at different indicators of giftedness, in my opinion, is the most effective way, but we have to be very well trained as educators in order for that to work out. I also wanted to say Cameron had a really good point about looking into strategies and techniques that we maybe should not use with gifted children. So being aware of what may help typical students in our classes, but actually may not be a good fit for the students identified as gifted. I also think that some of you did a really good job unpacking where your assumptions about giftedness came from. Several of you reflected about actually being a gifted child and what it was like to, quote, grow up gifted and how this has impacted your understanding of giftedness. Gifted children are seldom actually taught what gifted means, and there's a lot of assumptions from a teacher's point of view, but also from a student's point of view. So when we start talking about more of these social emotional needs, we will see the importance of really explicitly helping students understand what it means to be gifted. And the last point I wanted to bring up, just to kind of connect us to characteristics, is this aspect of what we call multipotentiality. Long word, literally it's multiple potentials. So with giftedness, students will often be really good at a lot of different things, right? So they are really good in art, they are really good in math, they're also really good leadership skills. So they have multiple potentials, so multipotentiality. This is often seen as a good thing, but I want to tie this into that question about the labor intensity of raising a gifted child, in that gifted children are often so overwhelmed because they can do so many things, they really struggle to figure out who they are. So that's a big challenge parenting children who are identified as gifted, as well as serving them in an educational setting. We will do a whole module on creativity later, but I did want to echo some of you guys who wrote about being surprised in terms of creativity, extending the bound beyond artistic realms, which is really important. We have what's called an art bias when we think of creativity, but creative thinking skills are really able to progress into all different types of domains. So I don't want you to leave this class thinking that creativity equals art, and I definitely don't want you to leave this class thinking that creativity and giftedness are not related. They're definitely related. We'll talk about this more later. They're not the same thing, but they oftentimes come hand in hand. However, the very, very creative child often looks a little different than the very academically more stereotypical child. So we're looking into how all of these different types of characteristics will manifest. Several of you, I want to end on this, mentioned that you were surprised about some of the questions and that you were still questioning them due to either personal experiences or maybe even conversations with others. And I think it's important to remember that gifted students are not all the same, right? So these are not like a list of sweeping generalizations. There are differences within gifted students as well. So I think first and foremost, keeping these characteristics in mind, keeping these myths and realities in mind so we can keep our assumptions in check. But most importantly, knowing our students and knowing maybe they are acting this way not because they're, quote, gifted, but because it's just their personality. So on the most part, you guys did a wonderful job. I particularly appreciated several of you who quoted the readings. Although that was not a requirement, I like to see you guys bringing in all the context that we are discussing here. So as always, if you have any questions or any concerns, either shoot me an email or feel free to drop by. Thanks.